In the small town of Rosewood, Judge William Price sat behind his desk, his eyes scanning the names on his docket. The courtroom was a place he knew well, filled with the rustle of papers and the shuffle of feet as people waited their turn. Today seemed like any other day, with the usual crowd of minor offenders standing before him. The sound of his gavel echoed through the room, and the people were called to order. The tension was always in the air, but it was nothing new for him. He had seen it all over the years. Emily Thompson stood near the back of the courtroom, nervously clutching her purse. Her shoes clicked softly on the tile floor. As she stepped forward, her heart beat a little faster with every passing second. She had always tried to avoid situations like this. She never meant to break the law. But here she was before the judge for a simple parking violation, the kind of thing that usually didn't attract much attention, but somehow it did today. Maybe it was the rush of a busy morning, or maybe it was simply bad luck. She had parked in a spot she shouldn't have, and now she was paying for it. Judge Price looked up from his papers, his eyes scanning the young woman before him. He had seen many faces like hers before, hesitant, polite, doing their best to be respectful. She looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place where from. It didn't matter, though it was just another case in his routine. As he looked down at his notes, he saw the violation she had been ticketed for. It was minor, but to him rules were rules, and he had made his reputation on being firm with the law, even when it didn't seem fair. Emily cleared her throat softly and stepped forward to address the court. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of anxiety to it. She explained that it had been an honest mistake, and that she had never intended to park in the restricted space. She knew she had made a mistake, but she hoped the judge might show some leniency. After all, she was a teacher at Rosewood Elementary, and this fine was more than just a financial burden. It was a symbol of something larger, a reminder that sometimes life could be unfair. Judge Price listened to her words, but he didn't seem moved. His face remained neutral as he turned back to his papers. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't offer any words of comfort, just a simple motion of his hand. And the ruling was made. The fine would stand. It wasn't the first time he had issued such a penalty, but for Emily, it felt different. It felt personal, like a door had just slammed shut, and there was no way around it. Emily stood there in shock for a moment, the weight of the fine settling heavily on her shoulders. She tried to mask her disappointment with a quick nod and a murmured thank you, but inside her mind was racing. She couldn't believe it. How could he be so cold? How could he not even consider her explanation or the circumstances surrounding the violation? As she turned to leave the courtroom, she noticed the eyes of the other people in the room, following her, some with sympathy, others with indifference, but none with the understanding she needed in that moment. She felt like an outsider in her own town, and that was something she hadn't expected to feel when she first walked through the door. James Thompson sat behind his desk in the mayor's office. His fingers drummed lightly on the surface as he stared at the paperwork before him. His mind wasn't focused on the mundane tasks of running the town. His thoughts kept drifting to his sister Emily and the fine she had received from Judge William Price. He even heard about the incident through a few calls from friends in the community, but he had kept his distance at first, thinking it was just another small-town matter, nothing worth making a fuss over. But as the days passed and the story began to spread, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the situation. Emily was known around town as a kind and reliable woman, someone who always did the right thing and rarely made mistakes. She was also a teacher at Rosewood Elementary and was loved by the children and their parents alike, so the idea that she would be slapped with such a harsh fine for something so minor didn't sit right with him. James had seen his fair share of unfair situations during his years in politics, but he wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions without evidence. He knew that things weren't always as they seemed, but he couldn't ignore the nagging thought that there was something more at play here, perhaps a deeper issue tied to race, something that had been simmering in the town for years beneath the surface. He didn't want to believe it, but the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily had been treated unfairly. He called his assistant and asked her to gather information about Judge Price's rulings. Over the past few years, James knew the judge had a reputation for being strict, but he also knew that in small towns like Rosewood, there were often unspoken biases that shaped decisions. He needed to understand if this was one of those cases where a simple mistake had turned into something more troubling. Over the next few days, James received reports from his assistant With a growing sense of unease, the data showed that Judge Price's rulings involving black defendants often resulted in harsher fines and penalties compared to white individuals who had committed similar offenses. James's stomach twisted as he read through the reports. He knew that this wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just about Emily's fine anymore. This was about a pattern of injustice that needed to be addressed. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples, as he tried to think of the best way to approach the situation. He knew he couldn't just ignore it and let the matter slip away, but he also didn't want to make a public spectacle of it. Not yet, anyway. James had worked hard to build trust within the community, and he didn't want to risk alienating his constituents by launching an attack on a respected member of the local judiciary without clear evidence. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't stand by and let this go on without doing something. Emily was his sister, and he loved her deeply. But this wasn't just about family anymore. It was about the values he had worked so hard to instill in the town of Rosewood, values of fairness, equality, and justice for all, no matter who they were or where they came from. James couldn't shake the unease that settled in his chest. The more he thought about the evidence his assistant had gathered, the clearer it became that something wasn't right. Judge Price's rulings were often harsh, but now it seemed they were systematically unfair, particularly when it came to black defendants. James felt a growing responsibility to address it, but he also knew that taking action wasn't going to be easy. The mayor had always prided himself on his ability to keep the peace in Rosewood. The town was small, and while progress had been made over the years, there were still old wounds that hadn't fully healed. He had worked tirelessly to create a sense of unity, to ensure everyone had a fair shot, no matter their background. But this was different. This wasn't just about a flawed system. It was about a person in a position of power who might be contributing to the divide that plagued the town. As James sat at his desk, contemplating his next steps, he received a call from his sister Emily. Her voice was strained, and there was a quiet anger beneath her words that James knew all too well. "James, I've been hearing the whispers," she said, her tone cautious. "People are talking about what happened in court. I didn't want to make a scene, but now it feels like everyone's got an opinion about me. About us." James took a deep breath, trying to calm the tension that was already rising in his chest. He hated that Emily was dealing with the fallout of his investigation. He had wanted to shield her from all of this, to protect her from the drama and the spotlight, but now it was impossible to avoid. "I know, Em," he said softly. "I'm sorry this is all falling on you, but I'm looking into something bigger than just this ticket. It's about Judge Price." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. James could hear the wheels turning in her mind. Emily wasn't the type to get caught up in drama, but she knew her brother well enough to understand when he was serious. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice more cautious now. "What do you mean, looking into him?" James ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. "I've been reviewing some of his cases. There's a pattern. Black residents seem to get harsher fines and sentences than white ones for similar offenses. It's subtle, but it's there. I think this goes beyond just your ticket. I think it's part of a bigger issue in this town, something we need to address." Emily's heart sank as she processed his words. She had suspected something was off with how she had been treated in court, but hearing it from James made it all feel too real. Her brother, the mayor, was going up against someone as powerful as Judge Price, someone who had been a fixture of the town for decades. "James, this isn't just about me," she said quietly. "This is about the whole town, isn't it? If what you're saying is true, we can't just let this slide." James exhaled, relieved that Emily understood. "Exactly. We can't. But I need you to stay calm. I don't want this to turn into something that divides people even more. We need to approach this carefully, quietly, and make sure we have all the facts." Emily nodded, even though James couldn't see her. She knew the risks of bringing this to light, but she also knew her brother was right. If there was a problem, it had to be dealt with. "We'll do this together," she said, her voice steady. "You're not alone in this." In the following days, the tension in Rosewood began to grow. Whispers of the mayor's investigation into Judge Price spread quickly, and the community became divided. On one hand, James had supporters, those who trusted him, who knew that his dedication to justice was unwavering. On the other, there were those who saw his actions as a direct challenge to the town's long-established order, a threat to the stability they had relied on for years. Some even suggested that James was using his position to protect his sister, accusing him of wielding power for personal gain. Emily tried her best to stay out of the growing storm. She had always been the quiet one, the one who focused on her work as a teacher and kept to herself. She didn't want to become a symbol of something bigger than she was, especially not when it involved her brother, who she knew was already carrying the weight of this investigation on his shoulders. Yet, as the days passed, she found herself pulled deeper into the conversation. Friends and colleagues came to her with their opinions, their concerns, asking her what was really going on behind the scenes. At first, Emily had brushed it off, unsure of what to say. But the more she heard about the mounting public debate, the more it became impossible to ignore. People were rallying for James, some calling for Judge Price's resignation, others demanding an investigation into his past rulings. Emily realized that her brother's inquiry had touched a nerve that no one could simply forget about or sweep under the rug. The more she thought about it, the more she recognized the deep-seated racial disparities that had plagued Rosewood for years. It wasn't just the judge, it was the system. The way things had always been done, with little accountability or transparency. Emily knew that if her brother wanted to push for real change, it would take more than just a legal challenge. It would take a shift in the hearts and minds of the community. One evening, as Emily sat at the kitchen table, she received a phone call from James. His voice was calm but strained. "Emily, I think we got something," he said. "I've been digging deeper into Price's rulings, and it's not just one or two cases. It's a pattern. The fines, the sentences, they're all disproportionate. I've spoken to some folks at the state level, and they're willing to take a closer look. But we need to be careful about how we proceed." Emily felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that James was moving forward with the investigation, but dread knowing that it would stir the pot even more in a town already on edge. The idea of rocking the boat had never sat well with her, but now she realized there was no turning back. The truth had to come out. "I'll do whatever it takes, James," Emily said, her voice steady despite the nerves she felt. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the whole town. We can't let this keep going on." James was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words. "I'm glad you're with me on this," he said finally. "But I need you to stay focused. People are going to come at us from all sides. We can't let the noise distract us from the bigger picture." Emily sighed and nodded, even though she knew he couldn't see her. "I know I'll be careful. But we can't back down now, James. Not when we know what's really going on." It felt like a turning point, like the town was on the edge of something important, something that could change the course of its future forever. But Emily couldn't help but wonder just how deep the roots of injustice really ran. Could they ever truly untangle them? The following weeks in Rosewood were tense, and the town seemed to be at crossroads. The public debate surrounding James' investigation into Judge Price grew louder with every passing day. The mayor's office was bombarded with calls, some in support of his actions, others condemning him for overstepping his bounds. It wasn't just about the parking fine anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger, an issue that had been simmering beneath the surface of the community for years. As the pressure mounted, James held firm. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. He couldn't turn back now. Emily, however, was beginning to feel the weight of it all. She had never sought attention, never wanted to be thrust into the middle of a political firestorm. But now her name was being mentioned in the papers, discussed on local news stations, and speculated about on social media. It was more than she had ever bargained for. Her friends at the school were torn. Some believed that the mayor was doing the right thing, that it was time for the town to face the truth about Judge Price's bias. Others felt that James was using his position to make a personal attack on someone who had served the community for decades. The division was palpable, and it was starting to affect Emily. The students she taught were talking about the controversy, and even some of the parents were questioning her judgment. One afternoon, Emily sat in her classroom, staring out the window as the children played outside. She was exhausted from the constant barrage of questions and opinions, trying to keep her professional life separate from the political firestorm. But it was hard to ignore the stares, the whispers. Her students, who once looked to her with admiration, now seemed uncertain, unsure of where she stood on the issues that had come to dominate the town's conversation. James had always been the outspoken one in the family. He had a natural ability to handle the political world, to navigate the tricky waters of public opinion. Emily, on the other hand, preferred to keep her head down and her actions focused on what she could control: her classroom, her students, her community. But now, as the mayor's investigation into Judge Price escalated, Emily realized that she couldn't remain silent forever. One evening, she received a call from her brother. His voice was more urgent than usual. "Emily, things are heating up. People are starting to take sides. There's no middle ground anymore. I need you to be prepared for the fallout. It's not just the judge now. There's talk of a full investigation into the entire court system." Emily felt her heart race. She had known that James' actions were making waves, but now it seemed that the town was on the brink of something much bigger. The notion of a full investigation meant that the cracks in the system were finally being acknowledged, but it also meant that things were about to get far more complicated. "I'm ready, James," she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness in her chest. "I don't want this to drag on any longer. I want the truth to come out, no matter what happens." James sighed, relieved to hear his sister's determination. "I'm glad you're with me on this. But we need to be smart. There's no turning back now, and the pressure is only going to increase. We have to make sure we have everything in order before we go public with the findings. People are going to try to discredit us." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility that now rested on both of their shoulders. She had always been quiet and reserved, but this was her chance to help change the course of Rosewood's future. She couldn't let fear stop her from doing what was right. "I'll stand by you, James," she said firmly. "We'll get through this together." The heat of the situation only intensified as James and Emily prepared to take their next steps. Word had spread quickly about the mayor's investigation into Judge Price, and now the whole town was watching. Rosewood was a place that valued tradition, where the old ways often ruled the daily lives of its residents. Change, especially the kind that challenged the system, was always met with resistance. But James knew that it wasn't just the town's future at stake, it was something much bigger, a battle for fairness, justice, and equality. Despite the mounting pressure, Emily found herself surprisingly resolute. The uncertainty that had once gripped her heart was starting to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose. She had been scared of the unknown, scared of what speaking out would mean for her and her family. But now she understood. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for the entire town, for the values they all claimed to hold dear. That afternoon, James called a private meeting in his office with some key supporters. Emily wasn't one for public appearances, but she agreed to come along. She felt she needed to understand the full scope of what was unfolding. When she entered the room, she saw a mix of familiar and new faces: community leaders, a few influential local business owners, and even some of the town's teachers who had quietly supported James' efforts from the beginning. As James spoke, Emily couldn't help but notice the tension in the room. People were nervous, but also determined. Everyone knew that pushing for a full investigation into Judge Price would be a major upheaval, but they also understood that it was the only way to uncover the truth. James was speaking with authority, his voice steady as he outlined the next steps. He wanted to approach the state's Judicial Oversight Committee and demand a review of Judge Price's rulings over the past decade. But they needed solid evidence, something irrefutable. "I know this isn't easy," James said, looking around the room at the faces of his supporters. "There's going to be backlash. People who benefit from the status quo will fight this every step of the way. But we can't be afraid. We owe it to the people of this town, to the future of Rosewood, to make sure that everyone is treated fairly. This is bigger than just one judge or one case. It's about the system as a whole." Emily could see the resolve in his eyes, the weight of the decisions he was making pressing down on him. It wasn't easy being the one to stand up and fight, especially when the system had worked in your favor for so long. The silence that followed his words was palpable. People were listening, processing, ready to take the next step, even though they knew the challenges they would face. One of the business owners, a man named Carl Donnelly, cleared his throat before speaking up. James, I've got your back. I know the risks, but I believe you're doing the right thing. If we don't stand up now, when will we ever? We can't let this go on any longer. The others murmured their agreement, and Emily felt a sense of hope growing in her chest. These people, who had once been bystanders to the town's long-standing issues, were now willing to fight for change. The tide was turning. As the meeting wrapped up, James turned to Emily, his expression somber. This is just the beginning, Em. Things are about to get rough, but we have to be ready for it. I can't do this alone. Emily nodded, understanding the weight of what was ahead. We'll face it together, James. You're not alone in this fight. The days following the meeting felt like a blur for James and Emily. The wheels of change had started turning, and with each passing moment, they grew heavier. The support they had gathered was solid, but there was still an undercurrent of fear in the town. The quiet whispers that had started months ago were now louder, more pronounced, as people began to pick sides. James had always known that pushing for change would come with its challenges, but now that it was real, the magnitude of what they were about to face hit him with full force. Emily, on the other hand, was grappling with the personal cost of everything that was unfolding. The school where she taught was still buzzing with conversations about the case. Parents who had once greeted her with friendly smiles now avoided her gaze, their expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion. Some colleagues had offered their support, but others were more reserved, uncertain of how to align themselves with her stance. Emily felt the weight of the division, but she also knew this was about more than just her reputation. It was about ensuring that the town moved forward, not backward. James had spent the past few days working closely with his lawyer, gathering the final pieces of evidence to present to the state's Judicial Oversight Committee. The pattern of bias was undeniable. The data they had collected from previous court rulings in Rosewood was damning, showing that black defendants were consistently given harsher sentences and fines than their white counterparts. The evidence was enough to call for a full-scale investigation into Judge Price's conduct, and it was time to take it to the next level. The moment came when James stood in front of the town council, a mixture of local politicians and community leaders who had gathered to hear his proposal. He had known for weeks that this moment was inevitable, but standing before them, facing the skeptical eyes of his colleagues and constituents, made his stomach churn. He had no illusions about how this would be received. His actions were controversial, and many people in the room were already dead set against him. James cleared his throat, his voice calm but resolute. What I'm about to propose is not something I take lightly, nor is it something I expect to be met with universal agreement. But the evidence is clear. We've spent weeks reviewing Judge Price's rulings, and the findings point to a troubling pattern of racial bias. It's not enough for us to sit by and pretend it doesn't exist. The people of Rosewood deserve better. They deserve fairness, and they deserve a justice system that treats everyone equally. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. A few murmurs passed between council members, but no one spoke up. James took a deep breath and continued. We've already begun the process of filing a formal request with the state's Judicial Oversight Committee for a full investigation. But I need the support of this council. We need to make it clear that we stand with the truth, even when it's difficult. We cannot continue to allow bias to go unchecked. One of the senior council members, a man named Charles Montgomery, spoke up, his voice tinged with skepticism. James, you're asking us to back an investigation into someone who has been a fixture in this town for years. Judge Price is respected, and his record up until now has been spotless. Are you sure you want to risk everything based on what's essentially a few isolated incidents? James met his gaze without hesitation. This isn't about isolated incidents. It's about a pattern, Charles, and it's been going on for far too long. The tension in the room was palpable as the council members exchanged looks. The mayor's stance was clear, but the decision was still in their hands. Emily, who had attended the meeting in support of her brother, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew the challenge wasn't just about proving the case, it was about convincing those in power to admit that things were wrong. As the discussion continued, it was clear that not everyone in the room was on board with James's plan. Some members raised concerns about the potential backlash, the risk of tearing the town apart, but others were beginning to speak up, swayed by James's conviction. "This town deserves better," one councilwoman said, her voice steady, and I think we all know it. The following weeks were the most intense of James's life. The town council had ultimately voted to support the request for a state investigation into Judge Price, but the decision had come at a cost. The town was now more divided than ever. Protests erupted in the streets, some supporting the mayor's actions, others staunchly defending Judge Price and the way things had always been. The media descended upon Rosewood, and the story made headlines across the state. James' name was everywhere, and while some hailed him as a hero, others painted him as a villain. But for James, the loud noise of public opinion didn't matter. He knew that what mattered now was the truth, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the consequences. Emily felt the pressure too. Despite the town's divisions, she remained by her brother's side. She had witnessed firsthand the injustice that had been overlooked for so long, and although the weight of the controversy was suffocating, she knew this was something they couldn't walk away from. Yet, as the days went by, Emily began to see the emotional toll it was taking on James. The constant barrage of criticism, the sleepless nights, the endless meetings, it was starting to break him down. One evening, as James sat at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples, Emily could see how exhausted he was. His face was drawn, and the weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. She sat across from him, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "You're doing the right thing, James," Emily said softly, her voice filled with both compassion and conviction. He looked up at her, and for the first time in weeks he smiled, though it was small and tired. "I know, but it's harder than I thought it would be. People are angry. They want me to back down, to let it go. But I can't. I can't let the truth be buried." Emily reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "You're not alone in this. We're all with you. The town may be divided, but the truth is stronger than anything else. You just have to keep going." James nodded, his grip tightening around her hand. "It's just that, sometimes, it feels like I'm losing the support of everyone who counts. It's hard when you're standing up for what's right, and no one else seems to see it, when it's your own people who turn on you." Emily shook her head, her expression fierce. "You're doing this for them, James. For everyone. Don't let the noise drown out your purpose." As the state's investigation unfolded, more damning evidence came to light. The Judicial Oversight Committee found that Judge Price's rulings had been consistently biased. Black defendants had been unfairly targeted, with higher fines and harsher sentences, while white defendants were often let off with lesser punishments. The pattern was undeniable, and the people of Rosewood could no longer ignore it. The revelation sent shockwaves through the town. Judge Price's reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins. The public outcry was immediate, but so was the backlash. Some rallied behind James, urging for further reform, while others, especially those who had benefited from the status quo, cried foul, accusing him of destroying the town's legacy. In the end, Judge Price was removed from the bench, and the investigation sparked a larger movement toward judicial reform in the state. But the cost of it all was immense. James and Emily knew that Rosewood would never be the same. The town had been forced to confront its biases, and although the road to healing was long, change had been set in motion. As the dust began to settle, James looked at Emily with a sense of quiet determination. "We did it," he said softly. "It wasn't easy, but we did it." Emily smiled, though she knew the journey wasn't over. "We'll keep going. We'll make sure this never happens again." And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had stood by them, they both knew that while the battle for justice had been won, the work to truly transform their community was just beginning.